the vast majority of the Latinx community, the Asian community, and others were not questioned.
There still were Asian and Latin American respondents that took the survey. They are represented in the overall numbers. We just did not offer it in multi-languages.
So I think what you're saying then is that you offered the survey to a cross section of Charlotteans, but you offered it only in English. So those who are not English speaking are not reflected in the survey.
If they were only English speaking, then yes, I think it's safe to assume that they are not in the survey.
They were not English
likely.
speaking.
If they are, yes, if the survey was only offered in English, that's correct.
That's right.
It may be represented in public survey, but our survey was only offered in English.
Okay.
Mayor, this is Ken May. Could I ask a question?
Go right ahead.
I know I took the survey, but I can't remember because it was a while back. But when you ask the question, you know, do you support more transportation? If it's asked in a vacuum like that, you know, it's like asking somebody, would you like more money? But then what do you have to do to get it? So did we ask the question of what were you willing to pay? Are you willing to pay more taxes in order to have different modes of transportation and increased transportation? Because honestly, I think that's a bigger and better question than just, it's like motherhood. Of course, we all want better transportation. It comes down to what do we have to pay for it and is it affordable?
Maybe I can quickly jump in. So there are two surveys. One that I believe Mr. May is talking about is the public survey that we did and we sent to all of you. We're coming to that. That had over 1,200 responses, and we're going to summarize that for you. This was done by ALG, not by the city. And the purpose of this was not necessarily about the cost of transportation, but rather to determine people's interest in public transportation despite the coronavirus pandemic. A number of you had brought that up during our May and June meeting, that are we considering the impact of COVID-19 on mobility during this process. So we wanted to take this private polling, which surveyed 501 residents of those 4 counties to determine interest. There will be a follow-up survey, which will happen and will be presented to you at your November meeting, which will ask the question that you're asking right now. How much will it cost? Are you prepared to pay for this? And that will be the numbers survey that ALG would do as well. So, yeah.
It's a good point. Other questions?
Yes.
Mayor,
Yes.
go ahead, Will.
Yes. So I just had a quick question, Ben. So in Charlotte, we have a unique challenge with being 50th in the nation in upward mobility. And I'm wondering if in your survey, because I know it's pretty broad in the questioning and the results that we just received, but in that, is it dynamic enough to be unpacked to where we can see how transportation could move the needle in changing our ranking in upward mobility?
That's a broader modeling question that gets into a whole host of other economic factors that's just you know, really outside the scope of what we do. But what we can tell you is that the majority of people do think it will benefit them. Exactly how we can quantify that brings in a whole bunch of other variables, but it also but it did specifically say that they think it will impact and improve their local businesses. So I think that all sort of feeds into what we're talking about, but I couldn't then use it to model the exact economic impact.
Thank you. Maybe it may be something that is able to be unpacked in the other survey. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, I actually thought that some of that survey did speak to the question of quality of life. that it was more than just an economic issue, that it was something that would improve their chances economically and otherwise. I think you touched on it a little bit in there. I was actually surprised to see that almost 2/3 of the people agree that their quality of life might be improved by that. And that has to mean, when you talk about quality, it means across a spectrum of economic mobility and things of that nature.
And I point out that number was highest among people of color. It was a significantly higher proportion among people of color versus white respondents.
All right. Interesting. Eric?
Yeah, Mayor, thank you. And it was perfect. I let William, we always fight. We usually end up wanting to talk at the same time, but his question and then your follow-up, Mayor, was exactly what I was going to point out was maybe if we do the follow-up poll, maybe identifying or defining for folks in that poll what quality of life is, because it's very interesting to see how high the numbers are in other aspects, but that question had the lowest in terms of agreeing with and the highest in disagreeing with. And I just didn't know if folks, when they were answering that question, really understood that spectrum of what could benefit them, and maybe just rewording that so folks can understand, or re-asking the question to break it down into the different factors of that spectrum that would impact their life. Because you might get a little bit different, a different percentage of agreement or disagreement with it.
That's a good point. Something we'll definitely take into consideration.
Okay. Other questions? Any reflections anybody wants to make before we go to the public survey portion? All right. Scott, will you tell us about the public survey and the summary and takeaways you had on that?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. To that slide. So I want to start, first of all, by thanking the task force members for helping us to distribute this survey. We launched it the day of your August meeting and just closed it out this morning. And we have had a really great response. Tywell mentioned we've had over 1,200 participants. Collectively, folks have invested over 225 hours in taking the survey. There were 33 questions focused on issues around transportation equity, post-pandemic mobility, different trade-offs between types of transportation, and then just general questions around mobility behaviors and preferences. You all have seen a snapshot, an early snapshot of these results before, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all of the results. Really, the purpose of bringing this forward to you all tonight is just to illustrate some alignment with what you just saw from Ben with the ALG poll. We did on this survey tests just to see if there were preferences among different types of trade-offs. So for instance, more than 80% of the participants in this survey said that they'd be willing to accept modest increases in travel times if it were in exchange for making Charlotte streets safer for all users. The top two changes that the public indicated they would like to see are more convenient public transportation and more travel options. 81% of folks said they'd like to walk more, 76% said they'd like to travel more by bus or light rail. And safety and convenience were the top two reasons for participants not walking, biking, or taking transit more often for everyday trips. We asked about some broad thematic types of things in the survey. Again, I think the thing to underscore on this slide is just that we're seeing a lot of alignment between what we have heard from you all on the task force and what we have heard in the survey. Safety, equity, and connectivity are three very clear themes that I think we've heard from you. And there are also three themes that have emerged as some of the top considerations for our survey respondents. These are the two questions that honed in on that issue of transportation equity. And we saw broad support for the idea that the city might focus investments on improvements and for the people and places that might be the most vulnerable and have the greatest need for more affordable transportation options. We also saw broad support for the idea that the city might focus limited transportation dollars to support a mode shift goal and make more significant improvements in transportation modes like walking, biking, and transit. We tried to gauge the anticipated impact of COVID-19. Of course, this is a bit of an apples to oranges because we're talking about observed behavior pre-pandemic versus anticipated, what people expect their behavior might be in post-pandemic. So this does not reflect real world observation. This is just what people reported to us as their anticipated behavior once we emerge into a post-pandemic reality. What folks said is that there's a decrease, about a 13% decrease in the number of people who expect to drive alone to work 5 or more days a week, and an 11% increase in the number of people who walk or ride a bike 3 or more days a week. So just general trends there of more diversified commutes. Folks who used to drive to work maybe 5 days a week are now having split mode weeks and may expect to be teleworking or doing some other things in the future. So with that, I can pause if there's any more reflections based on what you just saw from that public survey wrap up. And after that, we'll move along to some of your homework, which was to review that state of mobility report and offer some reflections on that.
Before we go to that, are there some questions on the public survey?
This is David Ward. I have a quick question, Mayor.
Yes.
Was the statistics, the 13% increase, or I'm sorry, the 13% decrease in folks who anticipate driving by themselves to work 5 days a week, and the 11% increase in folks who may take alternative transportation, was that based on a 5-day work week, or was that based on folks who thought they might be working from home a few days a week, teleworking, et cetera?
Good question. So we asked the question, how many days per week do you drive to work before the pandemic? And how many days per week do you expect you'll drive to work after the pandemic?
And I guess we assume that that's a 5-day normal work week.
Okay.
Right. Respondents did have the option to answer up to 7 days a week, depending on their job situation or commute pattern. But generally what we saw is that 13% decrease from folks who indicated 5 or more days a week that they'd be driving alone to work.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
That's okay. I just want to say again that we know that when people see numbers, you're always very careful. You want to dive deeper, and we understand that. What I will do will be to summarize the questions of the private polling and share those with you. But I will not be able to share the answers with you because they're private, the private nature of the polling, but we will get you the questions so you see that. But I also want to remind you that we did not ask the number question because we want to present that to you first. And once we start talking numbers, then at the next polling, which could really be a focus group exercise, frankly, we will share that result with you again at a subsequent meeting so we can compare. These numbers are going to be different once you start asking people their appetite to pay for something. But we think that this is a good place to start because it does tell us that our residents in the 4-county region are still interested in mobility to improve quality of life, to improve upward mobility, and also as a form of economic development. And so that's a good thing for us. And then the next polling will build on that when we start asking for numbers, and then we'll bring that back as well. So thank you. If you have any other questions that you're not sharing with us tonight, we definitely will be glad to respond to that later on or after this meeting. Thank you.
Stephen, are you ready to talk about the state of mobility report and that homework assignment that we gave to the task force?
Yes, sir, I am. Appreciate seeing everyone here again tonight. As you're all familiar, we generated a state of mobility summary report. It's about 40 pages, roughly, give or take a page, of facts, figures, maps, just some thoughtful information. I just want to be very clear, not intended to be an exhaustive documentation of all of our conditions here in Charlotte, but one of the things we recognized was we've hit you with so much information from previous plans that even for the practitioners that get paid to do this every day, to keep up with all that, it's hard to mine through it to find answers. So in many ways, we hope that this may have become a central repository of information for you. It's certainly no replacement for doing a deeper dive on some of those. But I'm not going to go through the whole 40 pages, obviously. And I know one of the homework assignments was for you all to peruse through that at your leisure and to focus in on areas with which you had some interest. There's a lot of topical sort of information represented. There's about 10, 11 different kind of planning themes represented on this slide, which kind of speaks to why we assembled the information. I want to be very clear that once again that not meant to be an exhaustive set of outcomes, because we've got a lot of work yet to come in the strategic mobility plan that will lead us to that. But let's take a look at the next slide. I thought it might be helpful as we entertain a conversation a little bit more about some of those findings, if I shared with you maybe some of the things that I'm seeing in that report, a little bit of reading of the tea leaves, if you will. And so I'm extracting bits and pieces of this selectively on purpose. You may find other things to be of greater value to you, and we certainly look forward to hearing those comments from you. Just a few things about general travel characteristics. You see on the left part of this slide that there's items here that really relate to our travel experience. This is kind of what we endure in our daily lives as residents and workers here in Charlotte. Some things about how long it takes us to travel or how much we might spend on transportation. And I'll tell you that generally speaking, these numbers, you can react to them, but they're probably not very meaningful if you don't compare them against other places and other variables about the overall health of a city and or the experience of a household. And so I want to be very cautious about what the absolute numbers might mean, but I do want to point out a few things. When you look at that 24.6 minute average commute time, generally speaking, that's not awful, right? But there are people who experience much longer commutes and in our community. And there are some that have some very small commutes. So there's a broad range that's represented in that. But to offer you a comparison, when we looked at the peer cities that we assembled between Charlotte, Austin, Minneapolis, Nashville, and Denver, and we could add 5 or 10 more to that list. This is just a subset. We're the longest, right? We're trending towards longer commute times rather than plateauing or shorter commute times. It's just a piece of information. It doesn't mean that we're in dire straits, but it definitely is one piece of information that's worth contemplating. The other thing that I noticed in that same box really was that we're about 37% of us are spending more than 30 minutes a day in our commute. And I think that, for the land use planners in the room, that's largely representative of some of the spreading out that has occurred historically. Obviously, the farther away we have to travel to and from, the more time we're going to spend likely on that journey. And you'll see a number here about the average household cost. Once again, it's a big number any way you slice it, but comparing that to other places, I'm going to share with you in a moment what that might look like. So don't be too concerned about those numbers, but maybe think about them in context to how we compare to other places and whether you feel like we should be trending up, flattening out, or maybe trending down when contemplating that information. I think the other thing that's always important to juxtapose with travel experience is really just the safety of our network, of our community when it comes to transportation. There's been some fantastic work that's been done by CDOT revolving around Vision Zero effort, an initiative to bring fatalities down to zero because one death is unacceptable. We can do better is essentially the mantra there. And you'll begin to see in the thematic mapping that we've indicated on all of those pages that arc and wedge configuration. So I'll draw attention to it here just for future reference. But one of the takeaways from the Vision Zero work is that 100% of our fatal serious injuries occurs on just 10% of our streets. Now, why is that important? It actually is an opportunity, because if you know that only 10% of your streets are so dangerous that these are the places where all of our fatalities are occurring, it allows you to bring focus potentially to a program or to your capital investments such that they align with that mission to improve safety for all. It'd be much more difficult, for example, if it was 50% of our streets, but it's only 10. And so we've got an opportunity to do something, but it also says that those are fairly caustic places. That 10% of streets are places with which really require some future attention. And then the last part of this slide off to the right is dealing with a terminology that we planners and transportation professionals often gravitate to better understand how people are traveling. And we talk about it in terms of mode shift, mode being the method with which we might choose to travel for any given trip. And so when we talk about commuting, you'll see that our SOV, the single occupant vehicle, that's those of us choosing to drive alone, is about 76.6%. That's fairly precise, obviously. We'll start using decimals here. But you can see the breakdown of the remainder of those trips. And here again, I don't think there's anything to be learned just from that number. It's helpful when we start to contemplate what influence does mode share have on a variety of interests in our community, whether that's our economic competitiveness, our affordability, or the influence of that result on things like the environment. And so there's a number of things that we all value. We have to start beginning to look at mode share as a place with which we might want to pay some attention as we contemplate strategies in the future. Let's take a look at the next slide. I've got just one more slide of observations here. And really this has to deal primarily with equity and access to opportunity. We heard so much in past meetings about the importance of ensuring that we all have an opportunity to enjoy all that Charlotte has to offer. And that's a big challenge because there's barriers in our community that take a variety of different forms. But when we begin to look at the influence of transportation and the relationship between transportation and housing in particular, we start to see some fairly troubling statistics. And so when you see maps like in the upper right-hand corner, we can begin to understand that the ARC has so much richness in it. It's the place where the greatest amount of diversity occurs in our community. It's the place also with which our greatest vulnerable populations exist as well. It's a place with which is experiencing disproportionately a lot of challenges with respect to things like housing cost, travel time, and access to opportunity. And so for those reasons, it's important for us to continue to examine that data with a close lens. But when you look at things like cost burden, I want to be very clear about how we might define that. You know, cost burden actually has a fairly technical definition. It's not just a characteristic or an adjective. It's effectively being defined as those communities that are spending more than 35% of their household income on housing. And so just a very quick analysis concluded that households in the ARC that are cost burdened are 23.6% when considering housing. But when we look outside the ARC, it drops all the way to 4.5%. That's a huge delta. The distance between that is something that requires some care and attention. I'm not suggesting there's an action there, but it says we should pay attention to this fact and contemplate its influence on other indicators in our community. So that's just housing. But when we start to add in the cost of transportation, that's where planners like myself get keenly interested, because you almost can't separate the two. It's hard to do anything in life without having a place to live and a way to get to and from. And so when we look at those two things in concert, we oftentimes refer to that as the housing and transportation index. And it's, as you can imagine, if you think about your own household budget, when that number starts to creep up above 35, 40, 44, in this case, % of income, it becomes incredibly challenging to do the kinds of things that allow families to plan for the future and ensure that they have opportunities for the next generation. Now, it's unfortunate here because we're going to win this contest. Out of all those 5 peer communities that I mentioned to you, when we slice the data and we look at housing and transportation cost, Charlotte has the highest. And it's a significant distance between us and some of the other communities that were in there. I've done a lot of work in Austin and in Nashville and even in Denver. And I always kind of assumed that our cost of living was fairly on par with those places. And it's easy to surmise that if you're only looking at one indicator, whether that's housing or transportation. But when you put those two together, all of a sudden we're starting to see some things that draw some concern about our ability to continue to be competitive and vibrant. And so that's why planners are continuing to talk about these statistics in ways that are bringing new meaning to how we think about transportation and the influence of transportation on our community well-being, not just in one geography, but the overall sustainable health of our city. And so with that, there's just a little bit of information that I think maybe allows some perspective about why we assembled the kind of information that we did. I know that was a really quick overview, but I'm hoping with that maybe we can go to the next slide and just get to the homework assignment, because what I think about the information is really not nearly as important as what you all think about it. And so we gave you a really simple assignment compared to past meetings where I know it took hours to do. But this one was really simply, what did you see in the data? So that first question, what surprised you most about the state of mobility in Charlotte? And then a follow-up for those of you who've already had some opportunities to read the last section where there's a strong comparison between peer communities. We're curious about what you read into that comparison as well. And with that, Mayor, I'll turn things back over to you.
Even before we go into those discussion topics, Bill, did you have a question that you wanted to raise about this equity and access to opportunity slide?
Mayor, not so much about that. I had some questions as I looked at the different comparisons on one of the things that really jumped out at me was the connectivity index, which is an issue near and dear to me. Now, this is street connectivity. I would contend that perhaps pedestrian and bicycle connectivity could lend itself when you cannot punch through streets, but the ARC was pretty well remarkably served with connectivity. The critical needs access map seemed to be pretty good for people in the ARC. And all of that, I think, sort of reflects back on when the city of Charlotte grew and in what form it grew as it grew, sort of within the Route 8, or Route 4, excuse me, area that was sort of pre-full workforce with women, pre-suburbia. And it sort of brings me to a conclusion on this, that reinforcing connectivity may yield better access and better use of different modes as much as actually adding more money to just those modes.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Anybody want to comment on Bill's comment? All right. The homework assignment questions were, was there anything that surprised you about the state of mobility in Charlotte? That's an open question. Was anybody shocked by anything that they saw in the report? Or Eric?
Yes, Mayor. I guess one of the things that really caught me, besides some of the things we already covered, was the population growth for Charlotte, and it got me thinking. We have the peer cities that are currently at our levels and where we sit today, but then I was thinking, since 2000 to 2020, we grew about over 50%. So if we continue even at that rate, and we double our population, by 2040, what will we look like? And we should be at least looking at what cities who are at that range today, and preparing for that for our future as well, just to see what they're spending, what have they done with transportation, what have they done with housing, and and take a look at that. I just looked at Houston is one of them. They're at 2.3 million today, and Chicago 2.6. And that's number 4 and 3, I think, cities in the country population. So that's what we're looking at in 20 years, getting up to that level of population. That should all scare all of us right now, looking at if we're that growth and where we're going, and we really desperately need to look at best practices for those cities, not just the peer cities, but where we're going in the future and what they've done with their investments and planning. So that was just one thing that got me thinking by looking at some of the numbers in the report. Nothing else really shocked me too much. I see Charlotte either at the bottom of where we need to be with the peer cities, or winning in the wrong direction and having the highest level of commute time, or some other metrics, but last in walk score and bike score, we're second to last in. And I think looking at other cities that have improved their mode share, even in our peer city of Minneapolis, if you look at what their percent of walking is, that looks to be one of a pretty large percentage. And I also know Vancouver, British Columbia, the way they surpassed their goal in mode share was, more than doubling the percent of the population walking. So I think that might be a key takeaway from this, by looking at the numbers and what we can improve upon.
Other comments?
One of the things, this is Ken May. One of the things I looked at when I was looking at the report was what maybe was not in it versus what was. And, that is when compared to the peer cities, what do they pay on a per capita basis for transportation? We have a $2.5 billion plus budget in Charlotte, and about 200 million of it goes to transportation. So less than 10%. And there's some money thrown in there for some other special transportation needs also. But what kind of money is spent by those cities where they were able to get to the levels they were and we're not? And, what's their tax base compared to ours? Did they have to have special, tax increases to do it? How did they get there? And what will we have to do to get there? So I guess those were questions that popped up to me as I reviewed it that were not answered in the study.
Any response to that from staff? Did we do any comparison on what actually was happening?
Yeah, just real quick, Mayor. Mr. May, that's an astute observation. This is simply a snapshot of characteristics of Charlotte, and then comparing those characteristics to what arguably is 5 good peer cities. I think we could all come up with 5 additional. Not primarily a study, but more just a reflection of information foundationally to help us with supporting conversations. Your observation is really interesting, though. I think the one thing that's difficult to do, having done this work in a number of states and in a number of metros, is that the overall funding strategy is oftentimes influenced by other things than just a local budget. And so it's always difficult to compare exclusively apples to apples on how much per capita might be spent by local government as a result of direct fees and taxes that are collected locally versus that which may be supported at the state level and or federal level. But yet it's still an interesting piece of information. And one of the things that we committed to do was during the funding and finance portion of our conversations was to maybe bring a little bit more information about how some other peer cities are addressing their shortfalls, essentially. because to your point, this is great, but at the same time, we have to have a fiscally responsible approach to how we support whatever strategy is put forward. So I appreciate the observation.
Thank you.
Other comments from the task force?
Mr. Mayor, this is Ernie Regal. One question I had, and I may have missed it, but as I went through that, there wasn't much mention of the Latino or Hispanic community in Charlotte. And I know we talked about it a little while ago in terms of that earlier survey. I'm just curious if there's something in there about it and whether the needs or the desires of that community are recognized or shown in this.
I don't know that geographically, well, we do. We talk about the arc and the wedge in the arc. And I'm sure that picks up some of that, but was there any more of a focus on transportation options in those those communities that might be considered marginal? Stephen?
Yes, sir. So all the information has been gathered. Obviously, it's based on census information. I think the thing that you're picking up on is that there's not something on page 10 that has the pie chart, if you will, and calling out specifically Hispanic or even Spanish speaking or an ethnicity representing Latin culture. And right. So that information is not omitted. It wasn't showcased in this diagram. I think that's a great observation. It doesn't change the results of the data, just to be clear, but I appreciate you pointing that out. I feel like that's something that should be added to that chart because it is significant. To the mayor's point, the ARC, the data that's represented in there is inclusive of all diversity. And so it's pretty clear that geography being well defined by that. I think, but more important to your point is that it's an important voice, an important lens, not to be lost on the process. And just a reminder about what Ty mentioned earlier, I think the one challenge with public engagement is that one method does not fit all. Simply stated, if you put a survey out there, it's not de facto going to reflect the demographic spectrum of those in the community. And so you have to be very intentional, either about taking it to certain individuals, or you need to be willing to identify that maybe there's a better way to engage certain members of the community. And so one of the things that is happening, that I know we've talked about a few times thus far, is that we're not going to rely solely on a survey or a poll. We're going to actually reach out and create some focus groups that represent specific demographic cohorts, different vulnerable populations, and or different interests that primarily are captured in the ARC in particular, because that's where we tend to see the lowest public participation rates as well. And so we're trying to do our best to canvas within the time frame and the resources available to get to those voices, even if it's representative. So I'm anxious to report back results of that when that work is complete in November. I think we should ask ourselves the question, how good a job did we do? And see what we can build as we move forward through the SMP process.
Geraldine?
Thank you.
Good evening,
Geraldine,
Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me?
Can hear you and see you.
Okay, very good. Good evening, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to thank the team for a really fantastic and easy to read report. It's rich with information, and the planner and me is kind of geeking out with all that's in here. I wanted to know if the team could comment a little bit on the emerging trends section of the report, which I found really interesting. We've sort of talked about these tangentially, but we haven't really talked about them in any detail, and they're certainly not in the buckets that we've been talking about. And just picking up on what Stephen said about the importance of land use decisions, and certainly that's part of our charge, is to support the comprehensive plan's policies. But it seems to me that there are some things in the emerging trends that can be potential supports to the direction that we're going in that are around policy change and may not be capital intensive. So I wondered if you can just talk a little bit about why you included this section and what we might want to do with some of these interesting ideas in this section.
Thanks, Geraldine. You nailed it, right? Capital projects are one thing, but policy is really what drives how we spend our dollars and how we choose to govern and make choices about trade-offs. And so you'll be pleased to know that this work's not being done in a vacuum. An extension of the comprehensive plan, as we've talked about earlier, is this idea of taking a Charlotte strategic mobility plan and kind of leading with the priorities and values from the comprehensive plan, using that as the North Star. There was a policy diagnostic that was done as a part of the comprehensive plan work that is being shared with the strategic mobility planning effort. So we'll be receiving that. And I think to your point, we wouldn't want to just suggest that we, collect more money and spend more money. It should be more about what can we do to align our policy with our aspirational goals so that we do achieve desired outcomes sooner rather than later. And so I would be expecting a policy element to be finalized. It's already begun, but to become finalized during the remainder of this phase 2 that we oftentimes talk about, the strategic mobility plan that follows the task force work.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't have anyone. I don't have any. Who's raising their hand? Someone? Pedro.
Yes, I forget who mentioned what was going on in the Latinx community and whether or not the other non-white ethnic groups and non-African American ethnic groups were being reached out to. And that's why I asked the question, was it being sent out in other languages? The other point is that we have to recognize, to Eric's point, that we have to think 20 years from now. These populations are going to comprise a more significant portion of this city as this city continues to grow and attract these demographics and these ethnic groups. And so their input now, I think, would be critical. And if we do not ask them in the language and in the culture that they understand and respond to, we may not get a full understanding of it. And they may once again be disenfranchised from what we're hoping to have, which is a global, equitable city that is inclusive.
Pedro, if any of us have anything to do with it, we're going to make sure that does not happen. And if it means focus groups, or if it means getting into those areas, I think we're going to have to know that before we can conclude this network in any way, shape, or form. I made a comment to the committee the other day, to the staff the other day, that we are going to have to test this plan, whatever it ultimately becomes, in every specific area of the city that we can, to see whether it meets those transformational goals that we've talked about in the beginning. And I know I'm looking at maps, and eventually we're going to have some maps that will focus on specific areas. And we will test the goals, the priorities that we set forth in such a way as to see whether we've got walkable communities, that the last mile and the first mile connect people to the system, not just in affluent areas of the community, but connect every specific area of the city that we can. If we haven't done that, we've not done anything that really makes any sense. There's another question coming up, but something that crossed my mind. Some years ago, when we instituted the blue line, the initial blue line from out to the southern section of the city, it was based on land use planning and what we projected that we were going to do. It would have been very interesting for all of us to have seen what percentage of people use their automobiles to get to work back then. And now that the system has been in operation for X amount of years, how mobility needs may have changed, whether we had mode shifts, a significant or appreciable amount that we could measure, what the impact of that blue line was. We certainly know that in terms of land use, and what we've seen happen with regard to development, a large part of that vision has come true. But beyond that, we don't know really what occurred as a result of a significant investment made. So that's something I'm not sure we can study between now and the end of this task force deliberations, but it does tell me, it would send a message as to how well these arteries, these greenways, these bikeways, how well they're doing in serving the specific community that we worked on initially. And it may give us some projection as to what this thing might look like going forward. Kiba? Kiba Samuel?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor.
Good evening.
Mayor Valls. One of the questions that you asked for the homework was what kind of stood out, what surprised me about Charlotte. I too wondered, given the amount of development that has happened along the Blue Line, why the percentage of citizens that actually use public transit is just over 3%. That was surprising to me. And I too wonder about the mode shift that may have happened there as the development has come along. Secondly, in getting closer to the end of the slideshow that we were given to review prior to this meeting, of note was that Nashville probably is, of our peer cities that were listed in the report, doesn't fare too well either in walkability, bikeability. It has some of the highest transportation costs as a percentage of income, and yet their transportation bond failed. That was of note to me in the report.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Very interesting.
I guess we should move on.
Are there other comments before we move on to the next part of the meeting?
Mayor Gant, this is Janet Labar.
Hey, Janet.
Good evening. Hello, Mayor Lyles. My question's more for Stephen. I think, you know, I moved from Portland, and I think our housing and transportation costs from the regional standpoint was also pretty high, but we knew that the problem there was around housing more than it was around transportation. So is there an ideal, I think when it comes to the cost and the division of how much income should be split that we should be striving for, or is that kind of a false measure to look to?
You know, it's like with many subjects that it's about the lowest income and the most vulnerable populations. And so there isn't a percentage that works universally. I think what we would oftentimes suggest is that the lower you are on the household income bracket, obviously the higher your absorption of housing income and transportation costs will be as an absolute percentage of your household income. And so disproportionately, it's always going to be higher. It's hard to look at it on aggregate. And I know that in many communities, there is this notion that, well, housing clearly is our biggest struggle, primarily because we see the shortage. You know, people that are looking for a home and get outbid or can't find an apartment or a home to rent within a price point. We all understand those. They're very real contextual topics to us. Transportation, however, is not one that's often talked about. And so It's not as if housing is not a problem, but I think that to talk about housing without integrating transportation as but one more ingredient that we can influence, and let's face it, it's easier for us in some ways to influence transportation choice than it is housing, because the market influences so much about housing. So I'm not able to answer your question directly and say that here's a magic number. I think we have to figure out what number is appropriate for Charlotte, because to your point, if you look at the Pacific Northwest, housing cost of living, a lot of other things impact that. And in some places, I'll give you another example. You go to Nashville, for example, and people are spending more on schools because in many cases they've gone the private school route. And so it's a totality of your household income that needs to be contemplated. Really, for the purposes of our conversation with the task force, we want to try to isolate the influence of transportation and understand the elasticity that it has on the other measures that are important to us. And I think it's a really interesting observation that's, folks are picking up that we've spent a lot of money on other travel modes, transit in particular, and yet we don't have that huge increment of mode share occurring in transit. I would argue that we're actually seeing increases. If you look over time, when we added that, we saw increases. But in isolation, once again, we're missing the other influences. Things like the cost of parking, the amount of congestion you experience, whether or not your region's still continuing to invest in making it easier for cars, where people live, our land use, all of those things you all have been exposed to, and many of you have participated in those efforts in this community. But to look at any of this information in isolation, I just caution us all, because it is complicated, and yet it's understandable. So as we navigate through the remainder of this process together, I think what we're going to try to do in the amount of time that we have is to showcase the influence that we have the potential to create. There is no quid pro quo where if we just guarantee that if we invest here, that we'll have this outcome. We have to create conditions where there is an opportunity, and therefore the propensity for it occurring is much higher. And that gets back to what Geraldine even said, because having this strategy is one thing, we have to couple it with policy as well. I think a big victory for many regions is simply to change the way we're doing business in some respects. Sometimes just repeating those processes of the past and hoping for a different outcome. You remember Anique Boudet from Austin, she cautioned us about that and said that it wasn't until they woke up and decided they wanted a different outcome that required them to do different things. And so I'm sorry I didn't give you a shorter answer or a more direct answer, but I think you comprehend all those facets.
It's very helpful. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Janet. Tammy, and I'm going to have to cut this portion of the discussion off after I hear from Tammy Simmons.
How are you, Mr. Mayor? Mayor Lyles. Just very quickly, I echo what folks have said about the richness of the data we were afforded the opportunity to look at. And I kind of go back to some conversations we've had in the small group meetings about equity. And as we look at the ARC and the fact that the percentage of people's income that is spent on transportation in our most vulnerable areas of the city is a huge concern. And I'm pretty sure that at some point, taxes and the tax base is going to have some influence over what the outcome of this transportation transformation might be. I don't know if this is a question or just more observation. How do we build into our discussion, our conversation, the fact that the folks who are going to need us to be looking after them the most are least able to contribute to the overall process of this transformational transportation network? I mean, to me, it's I can't move forward because I'm concerned so much about that huge population of people that, to Pedro's point, you know, could be Latinx. Certainly they're brown people, they're African-American people. And we've just got to be thinking about that because it's such a real element of this work.
That's an excellent point, Tammy. I think that last slide shown by Stephen that talks about equity and access to opportunity is very, very sobering from the standpoint that, and when you tie that into economic mobility, I think a question raised by one of the other members, the percentage of money spent just to get housing and transportation, which allows mobility and connection to jobs and other opportunities, is substantially high in this city, in my opinion. So as we address affordable housing and then getting the need to make people's mobility network broader than it is right now to reach opportunities, we have got to find some ways to address that. And that's it's the most motivating reason for me and you, I'm sure, to want to get involved. If people can move to jobs, to education, to bettering themselves in a city, and they can move through it seamlessly and at minimal cost, then we can achieve economic mobility, which is something Charlotte's been focused on. And we can have a far higher quality of life if we in fact enact all those modes. So that, when you ask the question, what jumped out of the mobility, the state of mobility, it's this business of equity and access to opportunity, which I think you focused on, that really makes some sense. Let's move on. It's a good discussion, very good discussion. Am I into the next item on the agenda?
Yes, sir.
Strategy and outcomes.
Yes.
Our technical team has been hard at work sifting through all the mobility needs identified through the various plans we discussed. I think you discussed a lot of that in the meeting that I missed, but they've been working on it with the goal of presenting a subset of potential project ideas that rise to the level of transformational, which we have been beginning to describe as task force members ourselves. Scott is going to give us a first glimpse of that transformational mobility network. Scott.
So before Scott does that, I want you to see that the work has been done. This is not a joke. This is serious business here. So these are Scott's twin daughters, and Susanna and Clara. They already developed this network, and they even have the money to pay for it. I really think our job here is done. Frankly speaking, I wanted to share this with you to see that not only are we doing this, but we actually have the future generation already thinking about what that network would be like. But I think moving
and they're ready to pay for it.
They're ready to pay for it. So Scott has done a good job raising them. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Ty. Transportation planners in training, I guess. So we're excited tonight to start talking with you all in a little bit more specifics about this idea of the transformational mobility network. We have taken all that you have communicated to us to heart and have used that as a lens to guide some of this work that you will see over this next series of slides. What I want to start by saying is that what we're about to show you is not all of the identified transportation needs from our transportation plans. The diagram at the bottom of this slide roughly represents the universe of potential projects from those plans. this is roughly what you would get if you just stapled all those existing plans together. And we understand that is not the intent of the Transformational Mobility Network. If it was, we wouldn't really need a task force to guide that work. So what you all are helping us to do is identify the subset of these projects, as Mayor Gant mentioned, the subset of these projects that rise to a level of transformational. And so what we have done is we've already talked with you about major categories of potential investment. We called those transformational mobility opportunities. And we have done some work to filter that universe of potential projects according to the priorities and aspirations that you all have been describing in our time together, as well as the ongoing community input that we've heard about and the goals of the 2040 Comprehensive Plan. And ultimately, we need to deliver some recommendations to Mayor Lyles for a transformational mobility network that is aligned with recommended funding and financing options. So before we launch into this, we want to emphasize that we are here in this process. We have not gotten to this transformational mobility network that is aligned with funding and financing options. That will be the focus of our conversation in coming meetings. I also want to reassure and clarify that this is not a final draft. What you are about to see, this is simply a first draft for comment and reaction. It is also not intended to indicate specific project details. A lot of this is based on planning work in progress. And so the specifics of individual project alignments, the scope, the limits, those things will change. At this point, we believe that the project ideas, the connections that they make, and the outcomes they produce are really the most important thing right now for defining the transformational mobility network. I'm going to come back to this slide at the end of this sequence because this is where we really want to get some feedback and reaction from you all. We had to apply some selection criteria and an approach to picking the different types of projects and programs within each of the 6 major categories. I'm not going to run through these at length right now because you'll get to see these again on the slides to come. But when you see this at the end, this will be where we try to focus the conversation because we want to make sure that we have reflected what we've heard from you all accurately. So with that said, we're going to jump into each of these major investment categories, starting with our rapid transit vision, which is our complete rapid transit vision to shape growth and connect us to jobs, housing, and opportunities of our city and region. This one is perhaps the easiest of the 6 to describe because it's essentially completing the CATS 2030 system plan, including the Silver Line corridor, I-77 BRT and Red Line commuter rail, the Gold Line streetcar, and the Blue Line extension to the south. We've heard pretty clearly from you all that prioritizing light rail is important, that creating more high capacity rapid transit corridors is important, and that using rapid transit to connect employers to areas of population and spur economic development is something that is a focus. So again, this one is probably the easiest to describe of the 6 major categories. I also want to point out on the left, the bottom left of these slides, you'll see the existing plans that inform each of the projects and programs that we've suggested. Moving on to the next major category, our bus priority network is what we want to use to help ensure that our access to opportunity as a community is not limited by where we live or whether or not we own a car. This is very much based on work in progress right now in coordination with CATS. They have a bus priority study underway, and so the selection criteria really relies on information from CATS in terms of the key corridors that they are studying. The overall vision here is to provide fast and frequent bus service throughout the city and change perceptions and experiences about what riding a bus is and can be in Charlotte. We've called out just a few key projects and potential corridors that are a part of this in different parts of the city: Central Avenue, South Tryon Street, Freedom Drive, Statesville Road. Overall, there's about 140 miles of new bus priority corridors that are represented on this map. These could look a lot different in different contexts. In some cases, it could be bus only lanes. In other cases, it could be queue jumpers at signals. The ongoing bus priority study is going to influence what this looks like in different land use situations. What we've heard from the task force is that you all have encouraged us to potentially consider repurposing vehicular lanes to incentivize things like bus travel, to extend and increase the number of high frequency premium bus routes that we have in the city, to improve bus shelters, and also more programmatic types of things around how people experience their bus ride and are able to track buses in real time. Moving on to our Greenway vision. With the Greenway vision, we'll reach into our neighborhoods to support walking and biking as a natural extension of our daily life. The big idea here is to invest in regionally significant Greenway corridors that starts to stitch together this Greenway network across the county and beyond. We've been coordinating with staff from Mecklenburg County Greenways on the types of projects that are highest priority to them. They are also informed by their Greenway and Trails Advisory Council on those types of things. And so we've taken that under advisement. We have tried here to identify key projects and programs that leverage existing greenways and also account for a lack of east-west connectivity within our greenway network. Our creeks and streams run north to south, which means most of our greenways do the same. And so you'll see here we've got some big ideas around east-west greenways like the Cross Charlotte Trail 2 idea, and this North Charlotte Arc, which is a Long Creek to Reedy Creek corridor running along this northern arc of the city. The Mooresville to Charlotte Trail is another big idea that is represented here, which could potentially extend all the way through Charlotte down into Pineville. We feel like and hope that this is consistent with what you all have told us in terms of stitching together the Greenway network, completing a more comprehensive vision of a Cross Charlotte Trail, and partnering with Mecklenburg County to extend the system. Next, we'll move on to our bicycle vision for all ages and abilities, and to establish cycling as integral to our character and mobility culture. The big idea here is really pretty simple. We, over the years, have installed opportunistically bike facilities throughout the city. And the aspiration here is to try to stitch that together in a more meaningful way to create really safe and comfortable commuting corridors, connecting residents to employment centers and providing a more affordable transportation option. So you'll see in this map, the dotted lines are proposed bikeways that stitch together what are otherwise complete networks that are on the ground today. Some key project and program ideas within this category: the Silver Line Rail Trail is a big part of this, running east to west. We've also suggested things like a longer Steel Creek Road to West Boulevard commuter corridor, as well as a commuting corridor parallel to the Brookshire Freeway. This reflects what you all have told us in terms of trying to stitch together a network that can be used for bikes, e-scooters, bike share, and other micromobility devices. You all have focused a lot on connecting people and jobs, not just with transit, but with our other modes. And so that's a big part of our thinking, and why commuting corridors was a focus of this work. With that, we'll move on to our pedestrian vision, which is really an investment in first, last mile walkability that elevates walking as the foundation of our mobility and community identity. What you'll see on this map is a graphic representation of an idea that we would go all in on, this idea of first, last mile connectivity. The orange buffer is a buffer around our transit greenway corridors and also around our activity centers. And so we have heard from you all through our conversations together that stitching together our pedestrian network, especially to be able to support folks who are walking to transit, to greenways, and to activity centers, should be a focus of our work together. The suggestion here is that we prioritize all of our sidewalk and pedestrian safety investment to focus on that issue. You'll also see proposed mobility hubs, which would occur at the intersection of other parts of our mobility network. For instance, where rapid transit and a greenway corridor cross each other. We know that these are critical exchange points within our network, and supporting those with greater investment is also suggested as an area of focus on this slide. Which brings us to our final category with our investment in the roadway network. We want to manage congestion and extend the capacity and connectivity of our roads and rights of way. On this page, you'll see new multimodal transportation options. You'll see areas of congestion where we know we may need some focused investment to try to help manage that issue. You'll see a support of our Vision Zero safety commitment because a lot of the lines on this map are driven by our high injury network, which Stephen showed you earlier when he was walking through the State of Mobility report. Some of the bigger projects and programs that are on this map include large new street connections like the Eastern Circumferential Alignment, the Fred D. Alexander Boulevard extension, Bryant Farms Road, Philemon Drive. We have alignments throughout the city where we have right-of-way or portions of right-of-way that have been dedicated but streets have not been built. And so the idea here is that we're trying to stitch together our street network and provide more route choice for all modes of transportation. We've also identified some priority roadways and Vision Zero projects, as I mentioned, and priority intersections that you can see on the map. Those are identified as priorities both because of safety issues and also congestion issues. And then there's more of a programmatic thing, which isn't necessarily represented on the map, and that is that in addition to the larger new streets, we know that we need more connectivity in other parts of town, and then a lot of that relies on partnerships with ongoing development. And so it's difficult to represent that kind of a thing on a map, but that has been part of our thinking based on what you all have told us. So I want to summarize and conclude in this way. It's going to be really difficult, and I imagine a little bit frustrating for you all, given our virtual format, to try to make heads and tails of the maps that we just went through. I think what we want to try to do is reinforce these big ideas and get some feedback from you all around each of these categories, the big ideas, and the selection criteria that we've gleaned from our conversation. So just very quickly, for the rapid transit corridors, the big idea there is, again, to complete the 2030 system plan. For the bus priority system, it's to reimagine what fast, frequent, reliable bus service and experience could look like throughout our city. For the Greenway network, it's to install these regional ped bike superhighways that connect throughout the county and to the Carolina Thread Trail beyond. For the pedestrian network, it's the big idea is going all in on that first last mile connectivity. For the bicycle network, it's to stitch together really meaningful, safe, and comfortable commuting corridors throughout our city. And then for the roadway network, it's to focus on stitching together more connectivity as a way to help provide more transportation choices and mitigate congestion. So Mayor and Taiwo, with that, I'd like to open it back up for conversation and reaction. I'm going to leave this slide on the screen for a little while so the task force members can have this at their fingertips.
Boy, you said a lot. Were all of you able to read those maps real quickly and figure out what you were looking at? That's a question to the task force. Does anybody feel as if the staff has not been paying attention to what you've been talking about to this point? Eric, Ken, and who else? All right, Eric, let's go.
Thank you, Mayor. I took screenshots of all of that, so I was able to go back and look at it. So that's why I was cheated a little bit. But I'm impressed with I would say 5 out of the 6 categories. In terms of seeing, new plans, bringing focus to new areas. The one thing though, the big idea with the rapid transit, I know there's no way that further, beyond the 2030 plan could be developed in the time that we have, but maybe the idea of looking at that some of this investment will go towards looking beyond that 2030 plan, since we're only 10 years away from that to begin with. And, you know, that was developed such a long time ago. And the only thing I worry about is, you know, is that the right plan? Does it need to be corrected, looked at? Is it meeting, you know, the goals of what we want to accomplish, especially getting folks from home to work? And it's the heavy lifter for all of the other items for, you know, mode share. It's going to move along with the bus priority system, move the most people the most efficiently. And that's the only thing that I see on here that, you know, I just would like, if I had a magic wand, we could just kind of come up with the 2050 plan and have it here in the slides. But I think looking at something to focus moving forward, to be put kind of in writing here as a suggestion that, you know, we complete that, obviously, maybe reevaluate it and then add on to it, build something in there that focuses in the future a little bit more to make sure we accomplish what this task force mission is trying to, you know, hoping to
All right. So we want to, you want to stretch that transformational plan on rapid transit at least to connect more as opposed to less? I mean, to go beyond 2030. It's your feeling that the 2030 plan may already be outdated
Yeah,
before you start?
Yes, because it's probably what the oldest, and staff could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the oldest one up there. Most of the other, the bicycle plan, the pedestrian plan, the greenway system, I think they were all kind of, are they being updated, or are they just a couple years old? So they all are pretty recent, and a lot of things have changed since that original 2030 plan was, you know, developed and came up with. And I think that's, you know, reflected in some of the Stevens draft, and why that transit ridership was low too. It's not robust enough. It's not getting folks where they need to be. It's not convenient enough to get to where you know, where they need it to be. So I think, you know, just making sure that we're fully, like, you know, maximizing that investment to achieve, you know, the goals of the task force.
All right, we'll come back to that in a minute. Ken?
Thank you, Mayor. I was actually going to direct this at Mayor Lyles, and I think she has dropped off the call. But as I look at it, and I agree with everything Eric just said, I mean, we have to take a long-term look. That's the whole purpose of this. But then I also look at, you know, what are the quick, low-hanging fruit, short-term solutions that we can make. And then I look at number 6, you know, the roadway, and 77%, I think it was, of our, you know, commuters are single occupancy vehicles. And we have these bottleneck, you know, thoroughfares, you know, Park Road, Providence Road, now Community House in the south. I'm not as familiar with the ones in the north. And one of the major problems I see is that the zoning, as I watch city council meetings every week, the number of multifamily zonings going up along those corridors continues to increase at exponential levels. And, you know, there's always a big argument. At the end of the day, they almost all get approved. Ballantine, of course, has just been approved for tons new. And I think we're continuing to exacerbate the problem among our most crowded roadway areas right now through zoning, which is nothing that this committee can solve. It's really a, you know, a city council issue, because that's who approves the zoning. But I see us continue to grow in areas where I don't see a possibility to expand the streets. So yes, we need a long range plan to, you know, cut down the traffic there. But what do you do right now with all the new people going into the area from uptown all the way south on those 3 or 4 congested areas that just continue to become more congested? You know, how do we fix that?
part of the way we fix it, Ken, is to run the Silver Line and connect it in to Ballantyne so that people can catch the train and get downtown and the other places that need to be going.
But I don't think the Silver Line is heading towards Ballantyne as of right now. It's not part of the plan, is it?
The Blue Line, I'm sorry.
The Blue Line, yes.
Blue Line, I'm sorry. Yeah. And I think those are tied into, let me hear from Kiba. And I think Ty wants to speak to some of this. Kiba?
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to respond to, I think Eric made a comment about the 2030 CATS plan and how frequently it might be updated. If I'm not mistaken, I think the most recent update was in early 2019. I remember seeing a presentation about it that came to the Planning Commission. And then a point of clarification on the roadway network slide. There was some information on there about the priority intersections. And I just wondered if that particular slide, were there any specific exclusions? Like was there a particular focus to city maintained roads versus state maintained roads, et cetera? Scott, that might be a question for you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I can try to go back a couple slides. One of the things that we were mindful of in preparing this slide is that we have a state-funded transportation program with projects on the list that are in various stages of planning and design. And so what you're seeing on the map is in sort of the gray lines, those are those planned state projects. The dashed lines are the new potential projects that we are suggesting in this first draft. And those projects occur both on state maintained and locally maintained roads. It's been true in our past that we've used local dollars to build projects on state roads as well as local roads. And so that's something we could choose to do in the future.
Yeah, I think Ms. Samuel actually addressed that. I was going to say, while I do understand what Eric said, but both the Blue Line to Ballantyne as well as the expansion to the addition to the Silver Line in Union past Matthews and also going to Belmont were added after the 2006 transit system plan. So I do get that, but I also understand that in any community like ours, rail forms the backbone, and then you just have to build on it with your bus network, your trails network, your bicycle network, because not every roadway is suited for a rail investment. So, but I do understand that in terms of wanting to go beyond where we are today. I'm sure that we will have that conversation again when we start talking numbers with you on October 22nd as well.
Thanks, Ty. Other questions? Let's see, do I have anybody else that wanted to speak to this? My impression is that if we did all the things that are projected here and we thoroughly understood how they mesh together, and I know that when you saw that first map that showed all of them sort of overlaid on each other, it is absolutely confusing. And perhaps we may find a graphic way of picking out sections. I think I alluded to this earlier, picking out sections of the city and then going from how is this area impacted by rapid transit? How is it impacted by buses? How is it impacted by bikeways and greenways? And just take a look at those areas and start to see them in larger graphic form. We may be able to get some feel for how well we're doing on that. The only plus that I can say in terms of reading the map is that first one just was very colored and seemed to cover the entire county. And that's a plus, because that means some kind of network is in your area, no matter where you are and what the standing might be, your economic standing or anything else is at that point in time. So from that standpoint, I think we are on the road to something transformational. I think Ken's comment or Eric's comment that the rapid transit is already caught up to itself. I mean, 2030 is 9 years from now. In truth, I'm not sure we can build it all in 9 years. But what I saw in the rapid transit drawings is that to stretch it to 2050 means a connection to Concord, to Gastonia, to Rock Hill. It is a kind of beyond Charlotte plan where the work is working with other governments, maybe even other states, to extend that rapid rail system into areas that feed into Charlotte. That to me looks like 2050. 2030 does look like 2035 maybe, but seems to me, at least my reading of it, first blush, and I'm willing to be educated on this, is that you're reaching to the small towns in the north with the red line. You're reaching to the eastern end of the county, Matthews. You're reaching past Pineville now, you're already there. And you're going toward the airport and toward Gaston County. And I agree with Ty, the investment in rail and the corridors that you have to put down, we may have to feed in other ways. So I guess I'm slightly disagreeing, Eric, that 2050 gets beyond the purview of the county, although I think in talking to the people in the Central Anna region and the Business Alliance, we need to look beyond Mecklenburg County. But on that particular plan, I actually think we're covering every end of the county that we will probably want to cover. But I'm wide open to how we might make that even more aggressive and more transformational. And I'm only speaking now to rapid transit. I thought that had covered pretty much what we could do. Any other comments? All right, then can I get a show of hands for people who believe that the transformational mobility network is on the right track? I don't see anybody raising their hands. Okay, that looks like most of you who are here, and that's good. Was there anything missing from the technical team's approach to assembling this draft? Does anybody think, well, I think Eric's already said he thinks that it could have been more forward-thinking years. Anybody else? You think?
Mayor, this is
think
Bill.
citizens, yes, sir.
If I may, the element that always,
Bill?
yes,
Go ahead.
the element that always, I guess, eludes me is how these investments support the land use vision and link to greater opportunity, in particular for those that need the greater opportunity. Moving around just for commuting purposes is maybe a third of the trips that we make. 2/3 of the trips are for other reasons. So as I look at those first mile, last mile connections for pedestrian and bicyclists, how I make those connections to support land uses that are within the range of most people who we could entice to use their feet or their bikes to get somewhere. So that's an element that I really want to see us build in.
It's a very good comment, Bill. I think we start to get to see that if we can look at graphically what might be happening. Someone else?
Mr. Mayor, this is David. I think to maybe build on Bill's point, using your feet or a non-modal form of transportation to get to a light rail or to get to a bus, allowing that connectivity from a neighborhood that has a dead end with, a half acre of land behind it, but there's a light rail stop, what would be, 300 yards away, creating some sort of pathway for them to get there, creating connections within the city to accommodate multiple modes of transportation that we're not seeing now, I think would be really, really helpful.
Good comment. Very good. Thank you. Is that Eric again? Eric?
Yeah. Mayor, thank you. I just want to make sure other folks got to speak. And then I just wanted to clarify my comment since it kind of arose a lot of response. Just to clarify, it's more, and I'm fully aware that the 2030 plan has been added to and adapted and tweaked, but I think it's more that it hasn't left the original corridors that were defined back in 2006 or in 2006. And my point, we can't identify those new corridors in the time that we have. So we're stuck in a rock and a hard place there. So the point it was more kind of making, if we could add it as an aspirational goal that, that the next 2.0 corridor, plan is put into place to be worked on as a result, as a recommendation to the mayor, that we start looking at identifying some more rapid transit corridors that maybe just bus, BRT, as we, include true BRT. And only one of those have been identified in the current 2030 plan. And I think that would be, a mistake to not work on identifying those and broadening, different areas to explore, especially when that ties into the goal of getting folks to work. I mean, is everyone satisfied with those corridors connecting to the most jobs, the largest job suppliers? And I know healthcare is the biggest employer in the area, and how much of their workplaces are left out from rapid transit, and how you can get there in that first and last mile is obviously important as well in those corridors. But that was just my point, is to make sure that we're not missing that opportunity to look beyond the corridors that have been initially adopted and then expanded. We just want to make sure we're not missing that. That's all my concern.
Thanks, Eric. Well received. All right. Anybody else? You have any others?
Eric, I'd like to add to what you just said. I am big on the large transit projects, and I'm really big on the fact that we need to put some stuff in place now, because looking at the growth that we have already experienced and we're expecting to experience, we're going to have to do it, and we're going to have to do it now. But one of the things I was thinking about, you talking about that first and last mile, and then also with the larger arteries, we could possibly maybe expand even the trolley systems that we have. Thinking about folks coming into different, that is another option. If we don't have the light rail, we can't maybe open up, if we don't see any other corridors that we could use, maybe we could expand our trolley system. So just an idea.
Thank you so much. Is it Geraldine?
Yes, Geraldine.
Geraldine?
Hey, hi. Just wanted to say that I thought the team did a great job in putting together this roadmap. It seems like it covers a lot of the conversation that we had and responds to comments and the existing plans. I wonder, I mean, the devil's always in the details when it comes to implementation, right? And that's part of our charge. And how we start to bring the equity lens to the implementation of some of this. And I'm wondering if there's some of that really rich data from the State of Mobility report that can help us think through how do you start to match needs and conditions on the ground with this toolkit of potential investments that you've just laid out. So how can we, I don't know if there's a series of indicators that can be created that would help us or help the city start to pinpoint how to apply these ideas in particular communities based on the needs that they have here and now for transportation access and connectivity and things like that. So I don't know if the team has thought about how to use some of the data that and information that was in the report to help us think through how to bring a sort of a data-driven approach to the implementation strategy.
Anybody here on the team?
So I can respond briefly to that. Geraldine, you've sort of just previewed some of our next couple of meetings together. We want to figure out a way to evaluate and describe the impact of what we just showed you so that it's a little bit more clear what we think it might accomplish for us. So all that to say, stay tuned. I think we're tracking right along with you and hope to bring you more in coming meetings.
Okay. Do I see any more hands? I see somebody's hand up.
I think Geraldine just said something.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think that gets us to the public comment portion. Do I have any?
Yes,
No?
I've got a few.
You've got a few here?
I can share them.
All right,
That's okay.
go ahead.
So I'll kind of go back to what Eric was also saying, that the Connect Beyond that Geraldine's group is working on. And actually, it's not just Geraldine's group. Apologies for that. It's City, CATS, CRTPO, Central Line Regional Council. We're all working on the Connect Beyond, which really will identify other rapid transit corridors as well, extending into other counties beyond Mecklenburg. And so working closely with that team is very important to us. And you spoke, Geraldine interviewed Mayor Gant a couple weeks ago, and I think that we have areas of leveraging between the two, of synergy rather between the two. But a few comments actually from the public. One, kind of similar to that, is from Christine Davis, who said we should work with Mecklenburg County in achieving the Greenway system. And I think that that's part of our goal here as well. Another one from Kidron French said, this is great to begin with. Then regarding the polling and survey, don't throw away the surveys and the polls, but make sure there's more inclusivity. And then next three comments from Maureen, that we need to have trails, shared paths, protected bike lanes and sidewalks, because not everybody can use the other modes of transportation. And I think this is Maureen responding to what Bill had said earlier with regards to connectivity. And while connectivity is very important, so is multimodal investment. And then Maureen also said that the desire for clean air is very basic to transportation and good health. So those are the comments that we've received.
Very good. Todd, do you want to tell us about the remaining schedule and perhaps an opportunity that might be before us?
Yes, so thank you, Mayor Gant. So we're looking at the possibility of having a face-to-face meeting on October 22nd. I know that a number of you would definitely love that. Now we know that we're in Governor's Phase 3 and we're limited to 25 people indoor, but we will try and see how we can make it work with those 25 people and others virtually. but I will get that information to us this week, hopefully before the end of this week, as to the location. It will be the same time on October 22nd, and it's going to be uptown, or at least at the edge of uptown, but I will firm up that location and share that with everyone this week. We'll be focusing on what will it cost. Now that you've seen this network, what it looks like from those 6 buckets, we're going to focus a lot on what it will cost and how do we pay for it. This is when it starts to get real. And what we've shown you is a lot of Cadillac, so to speak. If you want to build rail, want to expand our bus service system, and want to build a greenway system out successfully and really stitch together a lot of gaps that we have in our mobility system. So the 22nd will be the time when we start talking about the numbers and how we pay for it. And I also want us to take a very good look at what we shared with you tonight. We will send that email out tomorrow to all of you, the presentation. And then if there are questions that you have with regards to specific mode or all of them, please feel free to share those with us before the next meeting. But we definitely look forward to the 22nd. And we'll be sharing, we'll be talking to you at that point in time, but also hearing from you about the cost and how we walk through the different mechanisms to paying for this system. Thank you very much. I'll turn that back to you, Mayor.
So I'm going to assume nobody's going to miss October 22nd. That is, it's going to be an interesting meeting. As we will tie all of the favorable comments we got back in the survey and the polls to beginning to look at numbers and what it might cost and what maybe ultimately recommend. I actually think we're going to need another additional meeting, perhaps prior to our November 17th meeting. And so that would be October 22nd, an interim meeting, and then the November 17th meeting, and then we'll have one in December. Okay. So we may be trying to schedule with you another meeting, and that will be sometime after the election and before the November 17th scheduled meeting. This will give us enough time to review and discuss the network and the cost situation again, because that's going to be a very serious part of our recommendation ultimately to the mayor. And that needs to be well thought out as something that may, in fact, influence the direction that the city may go in. So we need more time to make sure we're deliberating that. And I want to thank you, Ty, for trying to set up our first in-person meeting. Honestly, I just would love to see you folks. Not that we're going to be able to hug and kiss each other, but we will at least be in one room. So please work hard on that. When is the governor's next phase going to come in? Isn't that October 23rd?
I think it's after the election. Is it October 23rd?
No, I think. Okay. Yeah, the October. We don't know what it'll say. Wear your masks so that it'll be a progressive announcement on October 23rd, not one that takes us back. But thank you again for the time you've given, and we will see you in the upcoming meeting in 2 weeks, October 22nd. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.